Global viewers, thank you so much for your patience as we kick off part 2 of our Global Earth Day broadcast. I'm thrilled to have in studio with us today Kathleen Rogers, president of Earthday.org. Kathleen, thank you for being here. Tell us just a little bit about what it means for Earth Day today as it relates to Ukraine.
Well, we've had a long relationship with Ukraine going back decades. We have many NGOs that we work with. Our feelings and the extraordinary effort that Ukrainians have made to clean up the environment over the last 18 years has just been such a rewarding experience to watch in such a great country. We are particularly pleased that we were able to bring the Deputy Environmental Minister, Iryna Stavchuk, here with us. Thank you so much for making your time for us and for the panel that will address this incredibly difficult issue, which is environmental crimes that are now occurring every minute in Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the Russian military has fired more than 2,000 missiles into Ukraine. Around 85,000 tons of destroyed Russian military equipment is laying in sites and countryside. According to the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, about 300,000 square kilometers of Ukraine's territory need demining, including explosives installed by Russian troops in forests and on vast areas of arable land in Ukraine, which as a result cannot be used for agriculture. Dozens of Ukrainian nature reserves and national parks have suffered significant damage, such as the destruction of Ramsar sites at the coast of the Azov and Black Seas and in the lower reaches of the Danube and the Dnipro rivers. The Russian military has caused significant damage to water supply, sewerage, and communication systems, directly threatening fresh water supplies. UNICEF in Ukraine estimates that up to 6 million people now have no regular access to drinking water. Russians are targeting infrastructure and industrial sites, explosions releasing tons of poisonous chemicals. They are putting oil processing plants on fire that is extremely hard to quench. From the very beginning, the war put the world on the brink of a nuclear disaster. Russian army started off by occupying Chernobyl nuclear power plant. They kept hostage the employees and didn't allow the rotation, damaged the power supply system, which is critical to safety of operations, damaged monitoring and research equipment. They built fortifications and burned grass and bushes in highly contaminated red forest. While leaving, the occupiers stole and damaged 133 radiation sources, which are highly dangerous if handled unprofessionally. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is still controlled by the Russian military. This war needs to be stopped as soon as possible, before its cost is too high for the whole humanity.
Good evening and warm greetings from Kiev. Today is the 58th day of Russian military aggression in Ukraine. It's 58 days of horror, of tears, of losses of people all over Ukraine. But it is also 58 days of bravery of Ukrainian army and volunteers, of consolidation and support, and of hopes and praise to stop this war. I would like to thank every country and every individual who helps us in fight of the Russian aggression and also provides humanitarian support to our people. Thank you very much. As nature, of course, is also suffering a lot, and nature has no borders, and it is being also raped and tortured by Russian invasion. Ukraine is a large industrialized country with thousands of industrial sites, 4 nuclear power plants, dozens of dams, and other environmentally sensitive objects. As you could hear from the video, there were more than 2,000 missiles being issued into Ukraine, as well as countless artillery shells, mines, and air bombs. And of course, all this has major damages to infrastructure, but also to the nature. Nuclear threat is one of the biggest. You've heard about Chernobyl exclusion zone, and that's a place where huge nuclear catastrophe happened in 1986. And this place also still has nuclear fuel storage facilities and other nuclear waste. And when the first day the Russian troops came into Chernobyl zone, we already fixed the 7 times increase in the radioactive pollution in the area due to the heavy machineries bringing up the dust. But actually, when the Russian troops left the place, we learned that they damaged completely the monitoring system for radioactive pollution. They stole 133 hazardous sources of radiation, and they were even digging trenches in the highly contaminated red forest. Now Chernobyl is under Ukrainian control, but Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is still under the control of Russian army. And there were also horrible events happening there. They burned an office building to the ground. They shelled the confinement of the first nuclear reactor. And they were also blowing up the explosive on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. They still have heavy weapons, and they also mined dam of the Kakhovka reservoir nearby. So whatever intended or unintended mistake or action happens there, it can lead to huge environmental catastrophe. Of course, Ukraine is suffering from many dangerous industrial enterprises which have been hit with explosions and fires. That's oil depots causing large-scale fires, but also other places. And Russians are also using banned bombs with white phosphorus, which is heat for cities, but also for the nature. I would also like to address the issue of climate change. We still have to calculate the impacts of this war to climate change, but we expect that it will be enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions which were embedded in numerous destroyed infrastructure, military equipment and buildings, which now would have to be rebuilt. But we also expect that the war would have global impacts on climate in a bad sense, because financial resources might go to military expenditures as the world is not in peace, rather than directed to climate change mitigation and adaptation programs. There are issues of global food supply, because 1/3 of Ukrainian territory would not be able to plant agricultural products, and we are one of the major suppliers. In a good sense, we hope that many countries all over the world, including my own country, would aim to reduce dependence on fossil fuels as much as possible. And the Russian regime and this war, to a large extent, is funded with fossil fuel exports to Europe and other countries from Russia.
Thank you, Iryna. My name's Carl Bruch. Welcome all. I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am president of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. I will be moderating today's discussion. We have an amazing panel of experts. You just heard from Iryna Stavchuk, who is the Deputy Minister of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine for European integration. Before assuming this role, she was the Deputy Minister of Energy and Environmental Protection of Ukraine. Also joining us today is Stefan Smith, who is a Senior Program Manager with the UN Environment Program, working on response to disasters and conflict. He has a background in international news agency journalism and news analysis in multiple fragile and conflict-affected contexts. Michael Bothe is Professor Emeritus of Public Law at the J.W. Goethe University, Frankfurt, Main. For more than 50 years, he's been an expert in the law of war and on environmental law. Among his many posts, he was president of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. And José Allen is an environmental attorney with 45 years of experience in the private sector, state government, and the U.S. Department of Justice. José also served as a commissioner on the UN Compensation Commission, which was created in the aftermath of the 1990-91 Gulf War to require Iraq to pay reparations for damage, including environmental damage, resulting from Iraq's unlawful invasion and occupation of Kuwait. I'd like to start the discussion today by asking our experts, with all the devastation, the horrors, the heartbreak of the war in Ukraine, why are we talking about the environment? Why should we care about environmental damage? Stefan, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. And good evening from Nairobi. Yeah, I think the important thing to stress really is that it's not one or the other. You know, we're not talking about humanitarian issues on the one hand and environmental issues on the other. It's one of the same thing. You know, when we're talking about the environment, we're talking about livelihoods, we're talking about clean air, we're talking about clean water, safe urban areas, public health, food systems, for example. So this is all fundamentally, it's about people. It's about a safe environment in which people can live. And if we're going to be able to address the issues around the humanitarian crisis, around the refugee crisis, then that will require a robust environmental response.
Great. And Michael, you've worked on these issues for 50 years, starting with the Vietnam War. What are your perspectives on this?
Well, I entirely agree with Stefan. Avoiding and repairing environmental damage means preserving the living conditions, the conditions for a bearable life during and after the conflict. There is no peace building without restoration or preservation of the environment. And in addition, the right of future generations to live in a decent environment and a healthy environment is at stake.
Thank you. José?
Well, Carl, I'll agree with Stefan's and Michael's comments. The only point that I would add is that concerns about environmental damage have always been present. We've always had to deal with the aftermath of war and its impact on the environment. I think the main change today has been the recognition that restoration and recovery of the environment is vital, and that compensation should be paid by the aggressor to aid those recovery efforts.
Thank you, José. And Iryna, I don't know if you have particular perspectives to add here. You're living this.
People want to live in a peaceful country, and of course people want to have clean water and to have all the basic clean environment, as it was already mentioned.
Excellent. So following up on Iryna's framing, we saw a wide range of environmental impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm wondering, from the panelists, are there any other environmental damages that we should be concerned about, and why?
Well, I'll start off. I mean, one of the things that we noted in the film that Iryna, the deputy minister, showed was the impact of unexploded ordnance and landmines placed there. And while those might tend to be viewed through the lens of post-conflict military operations, they can also be viewed from the perspective of environmental contamination because of the long-term threat that unexploded ordnance and landmines pose to human population. The other thing that we shouldn't overlook is the issue of monitoring public health and performing medical screenings to assess and combat the increased health risks that flow from environmental damage.
So I think one of the important points you make there, José, is that we don't truly know what all the impacts are.
we don't know at this time, and that's going to take the process, and it emphasizes the importance of doing proper monitoring and assessment, both on an ongoing basis and post-conflict, to really understand what the full scope of impacts are.
Excellent. And Michael or Stefan, would you like to add in?
There are a few things. There are environmental damages which are, so to say, typical for any armed conflict. It's industrial pollution caused by attacks on industrial installations. Not to forget ammunition storage, which is a military objective, of course, but the environmental damages, the toxic pollution caused by destroying ammunition storage are a civilian collateral damage, which has to be taken into account, and which is very serious. And another point is attacks on housing areas. Depending on the building techniques which had been used, the rubble caused by the destructions of housing is toxic waste, which causes problems. And we have seen that in a number of conflicts around the world, unfortunately. And last but not least, I would like also to draw attention to the question of loss of habitats, of loss of protected areas, which brings into the picture what I said earlier, the rights of future generations.
Thank you. And particularly I want to flag the damage to housing and other buildings, many of which have asbestos in them. So yes, it's not just simply a matter of removing the rubble and starting over. You have to figure out how to manage the ongoing health threats of asbestos. There's been a lot of misinformation, disinformation about the war in Ukraine and claims of fake news. One of the first things we must do is to get a reliable assessment of the environmental impacts. Stefan, you work with the UN Environment Program, which has worked on, they've done post-conflict environmental assessments in dozens of countries going back to the Kosovo conflict in 1999. Could you maybe share with us some of the experiences and lessons from post-conflict environmental assessments? Why is it important that the UN Environment Program do such an assessment in Ukraine? And what does this look like in practice?
Yeah, I think that the first thing which is really important to stress is that there's such an enormous amount of really important work being conducted at the moment, both by Ukrainian authorities, by Ukrainian NGOs, by international civil society groups, as well as by the UN and other international governmental organizations. And I think, what we're seeing at the moment is possibly unprecedented, is that we're seeing a huge scale of remote environmental assessment and field environmental assessment at such an early stage in a conflict. And I think this comes back to a point which has been raised here as already, which is this is really perhaps a turning point in the level of attention around environment in armed conflicts. And I think that's a very positive step. I think really the key challenge in Ukraine is really going to be around how do you consolidate and prioritize this information? How do you filter it? How do you then develop targeted field assessments on remediation and mitigation? And then also, and I think this is really where UNEP can assist. I mean, this is about helping the key parties, and in particular the government of Ukraine, to have the best information possible, to make sure that they're supported in trying to collate this information and to deal with these hazards, and to really then have a solid base of information in which they can direct their efforts as well. In addition, then what we can also support on as well, and what we will be supporting on is actual field assessments themselves, laboratory analysis, for example, the provision of specific technical expertise. For example, it's already been mentioned, the complexity of dealing with asbestos in urban waste, and also remote sensing and satellite imaging as well.
Thank you. And Stefan, you alluded to a number of organizations that are doing this sort of assessment. I'm wondering if the other panelists might be able to speak to the role of these other organizations in assessing environmental damage both during and after conflict. Michael, would you like to start?
Yes, indeed. Following up on what Stefan said, there are two aspects relating to fact-finding concerning environmental damages. The first question is who did what? Who pulled the trigger? Which then also relates to criminal law. And the other thing is, the other aspect is, what is the environmental impact? Where is the environmental problem? How can we evaluate environmental damage? So the effect, and both aspects are important. And we need fact-finding on both aspects. Now, coming to the practice, Stefan already mentioned a very important point. And this is civil society organizations who are doing fact-finding, mainly on their own initiative. In relation to the Ukraine conflict, we've had such fact-finding in the Donbas area, where since 2014, the environment is heavily damaged. And I admire some of those activists who did fact-finding at the risk of their life. So I think this is a very important point. The NGOs, civil society organizations acting on their own initiative. But on the other hand, there are governmental organizations, and Stefan represents one of them, perhaps the most important one, but there are others. When we get closer to the humanitarian aspect, it's the United Nations Human Rights Council or the Office of the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs. We have already in place a mission by the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE was just submitted. I have read recently a report. There's a 3-person commission. I have not yet seen that report, but this is an important aspect. So there is a diversity of organizations which are involved. And I think there is no point of centralization. Different organizations have different potentials, and they should all go ahead. This brings me to a last point, because you mentioned my former capacity as chair of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. That is an institution set up by the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. So there's a treaty-based body which has the task, if asked by the parties, to inquire any violation of international humanitarian law, and that, of course, includes causing environmental damage, which is unlawful under international humanitarian law. That commission, I'm no longer part of it, but I know it, has offered its services to the parties to the conflict. So far, I haven't heard of any reactions to this offer.
Thank you, Michael. And Jose, would you like to share some of your experiences from the UNCC?
Sure. Certainly, as a commissioner with the UNCC in evaluating claims for environmental damage resulting from the invasion and occupation of Kuwait, one of the central issues that we needed to grapple with was the question of the baseline. What was the baseline prior to the environmental damage that was caused by the conflict? And in that context, the importance of having good monitoring and assessment, being able to measure the increment of damage and be able to prove that increment of damage becomes very, very important to any compensation that might be provided for that damage. for some areas, it's going to be obvious that the change in baseline that occurred. You have an urban area with apartment buildings, office buildings, and now it's been reduced to rubble. It becomes more difficult when you're dealing with areas that have been previously heavily industrialized, perhaps contaminated from those prior historical industrial activities, and there it becomes more challenging to establish the baseline and evaluate the increment of damage, but it's no less important to do.
Thank you, Jose. And that's a great segue to the next question, which is shifting gears from impacts to action. And the question is, what can be done about the environmental impacts? I think there are two broad categories. One is environmental remediation and containing the damage, and then restoration, and then questions of liability. And I'd like to focus first on the containment and remediation of environmental damage. Stefan, UNEP has, for now more than 2 decades, worked to restore the environment in conflict-affected countries. Based on your experience, what are the priorities for environmental recovery in Ukraine, and what are the typical patterns of post-war environmental reconstruction that we tend to see?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer because we're still in what is an active conflict at the moment, and it's a continuing conflict. So at this stage, it's difficult to kind of identify any specific priorities. At the same time as well, is that what we've seen is, as has been mentioned, a heavily industrialized society, which has undergone sustained heavy attacks. We've seen significant urban damage. There's a significant problem with unexploded ordnance, damage to industrial facilities, chemical storage facilities, extractive sites, deforestation, impacts on agricultural land. And I think all of this, we've seen a large scope of various themes, in perhaps components of themes that we've seen in other places all around the world, but perhaps all wrapped into one country, and with quite a challenging and large geographical scope as well. So I think one of the issues, rather than at this stage talking about priorities, is to really highlight the extensive scope of damage and the extensive geographical scope of the damage that has taken place. I think in terms of priorities, I think obviously it's maintaining a very robust monitoring process from all of these partners, making sure that assessments are done quickly, accurately, and of high quality. And this is really the priority of this has to make sure that any recovery efforts and even when thinking forward to reconstruction and redevelopment planning is to make sure that this is founded on solid baselines and accurate baselines as well, so that the reconstruction efforts don't actually exacerbate some of the environmental problems. And I think this has been the case in many conflicts before, is that environmental recovery work or hazard remediation tends to be a little bit quick and dirty to some extent. The environmentalists tend to come into the show perhaps a little bit late, and then it goes back to business as usual, which is very carbon intensive and very destructive as well.
Thank you. Jose, would you like to share a few perspectives from the UNCC experience?
Certainly. I think that for the international community, a focus on providing financial support for monitoring and assessment and restoration efforts are as important as providing financial support for economic recovery or infrastructure rebuilding. And that needs to be part of any international effort that is made, is to ensure that there's adequate funding. I mean, one of the issues that we faced with the UNCC is the question of providing early funding so that affected governments did have the capability of carrying out the monitoring assessment, because if you're going to make a claim for compensation and you don't have the ability to establish the nature of the damage and extent of damage that you've suffered, your claim is probably not going to proceed or succeed. So you have to make sure that the funding is there to enable the affected entities to undertake the necessary assessment, and ultimately the remediation that becomes necessary afterwards.
Great points. And I'd like to shift now to the question of accountability. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how it's undertaken the war generated widespread agreement that Russia has violated numerous provisions of international law. The challenge, though, is how to hold Russia and the relevant leaders accountable. Usual mechanisms such as the UN Security Council, which was instrumental in holding Iraq liable for environmental and other damage arising from the 1990-91 invasion of Kuwait, are problematic because Russia holds a veto power. So, to the panel, what can countries and the international community do to hold Russia and its leaders civilly or criminally accountable for the environmental harms associated with its invasion? Michael, would you like to start?
Well, this is a great field. I'll try to describe the various aspects, one over the other. Let me start with criminal responsibility of individuals involved in the commission of crimes. The essential crime that has to be said in the beginning is attacks on the civilian population, which can be targeting civilians in the first place, which is a war crime, or by attacking military objectives causing disproportionate damage to the civilian population. And both aspects involve protection of the environment. The environment is essentially civilian, and damaging the environment in this context is a war crime for that reason. Now, coming to war crimes, we first think, and that has already been mentioned, of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction on war crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine, regardless of the fact that Russia is not a party to the ICC statute. This is different as regards the crime of aggression, which would involve a duty to pay damages for anything which follows. But this crime of aggression requires that the state of the perpetrator is a party to the conflict. Now, the International Criminal Court has started an investigation concerning the situation, but the second very difficult problem is to single out specific suspects, which is also a question of fact-finding, and I understand the organizations doing fact-finding are aware of this problem, and from time to time one reads information that this is going on. The ICC is not the only institution which is entitled to prosecute war crimes. On the basis of universal jurisdiction, any state is entitled to do that. And I know that in a number of states, not only in the state of the victim, Ukraine, of course, but also in a number of states, and this includes Germany and Switzerland, there are investigations going on. Wherever this ends is difficult to know, but if I could give advice to Russian officers, be careful where you travel. You may be caught in a state which has an attentive prosecution. Now, turning to the question of reparation of damages. This is difficult as there is no international court which has jurisdiction on the matter. there is, of course, one precedent, which is the US-Iranian Claims Tribunal, which had the task of sorting out the consequences of the hostage-taking case. This requires an agreement, but I think it's not entirely unrealistic, because after a while both parties might find an interest in clarifying the consequences of this war, including the consequences of sanctions on one side or
Sorry, Michael,
the other.
Michael, we're running a little short on time.
Yes, sure.
Wondering if I'd like to shift for a moment on the civil liability to José and his experiences with the UNCC.
Well, certainly. Look, the critical issue is, where's the money going to come from? It's one thing to assert and to establish that the aggressor is liable for damages. The other question is well, how are you going to get access? I do think, given the issues that you pointed out, Carl, with trying to establish some kind of international tribunal now, similar to the UNCC, I think the use of foreign assets held by national governments provides a mechanism for there to be a fund available to pay compensation. To my mind, though, the critical thing is that whatever form any tribunal takes, it needs to be one that is efficient, speedy, and fair. We don't know what that's going to look like at the end, but it seems to me that those are the key features that have to be in place. The Iranian Claims Tribunal, while important, became very protracted and is still very protracted because of the elaborate procedures that were involved. So I think looking forward, we need to make sure that whatever we do can operate efficiently and quickly and get compensation to the victims and affected governments as quickly as possible.
Michael, do you want to have a quick rebuttal or follow on, particularly as it relates to frozen assets?
I entirely agree that the money is there, but access to that money poses some questions of sovereign immunity, because this is state money, and normally this is protected by the rule of state immunity. Now, there are recent developments that's worthwhile inquiring into that, in this case, where the consequences of a violation of fundamental norms of international law are at stake, it is possible to argue that in this case, the duty of states to put an end to a violation of imperative norms of international law takes precedence over the traditional rule of state immunity. But there is a legal fight which has to be fought.
Thank you. And Iryna, I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on what the Ukrainian government is thinking about or doing in this area, criminally or civilly.
So Ukrainian government in a civic law is collecting all the information and recording all the cases to be able to put it in the International Court of Justice. In terms of environmental damage, that's, as I learned today, also many more information, and thank you for sharing these ideas, but we also have challenges in understanding how to assess what kind of methodologies use. We have challenges to quickly assess some sites because the war is ongoing and it's not always that we have access to the places. But we also see that the scale of impacts in Ukraine and the international legal system in place doesn't really fit. So we have to work together to find out new legal developments to be able to resolve this also for the hopefully not existing future cases, but also that Ukraine becomes precedent of bring in environmental damages, like making aggressor accountable also for environmental damages. And very much looking forward to cooperate with all of the international organizations, scientific organizations, legal organizations to help us on this process.
I'd like to close by asking each of you, what, in one sentence, a short sentence, what should be the priorities of Ukraine and the international community in addressing environmental damage caused by Russia's invasion? Stefan.
Okay, so I'll try and be quick. I think, look, the scale of the destruction that we're seeing is so big, and that in itself presents a challenge of perhaps almost dealing with a blank slate. And I think the overall message is that I think everybody needs to think big. The political will for positive recovery is clearly there in Ukraine. There is a requirement to support that. The need to think beyond just making Ukraine safe again and just really start to think big. Imagine the national, the regional, the global potential of a green economic recovery.
That was a long sentence. Well done. Michael, you.
Well, a credible and reliable fact-finding will be key. Second sentence, there is a task for the international community at large, a duty of solidarity, providing help, which means finance and expertise, which is there around the world and should concentrate on restoring the environment of Ukraine.
Thank you. Jose.
I have a very short sentence. I echo Stefan's and Michael's comments. I think those are the key priorities that we need to focus on. Two sentences, sorry.
Iryna?
Ukrainian people, and it was also stated by the president and by the government of Ukraine, we want to have the green recovery, to build it on the low carbon and green technologies. So we would very much appreciate cooperation on expertise and on financial support to make it possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for sharing your expertise today. This is a critically important issue from Ukraine to Yemen to Colombia to Myanmar and many other countries. I thank those who are watching the show for taking time to be with us here today. And Washington, back to you.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you to our speakers for having this conversation. Iryna, please stay safe. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with our global audience today. Much appreciated. And thank you to Kathleen Rogers and Earthday.org for co-hosting today's DC program with us. Moving on, we are going to now turn from the impacts of war to the impacts of agriculture on our planet's health. Please note for this next segment, we will leave time for question and answer from the audience, so please use the chat function to ask questions to our moderator, who will direct them to the appropriate panelist. It is my pleasure to now introduce the moderator for this session, Jillian Seaman. Jillian is VP of Sustainability and former Director of Food and Environment at Earthday Network. She is also a former appointee in the Obama administration, where she oversaw the creation and implementation of government initiatives that focused on sustainable agriculture in food deserts and disadvantaged communities. Jillian, thank you for being here. Over to you.
Thank you, Sheta. Thank you, everyone. Happy Earth Day. I would just like to say that, regenerative agriculture has the power to change the world. But agriculture especially is really facing a trifecta of potentially devastating challenges. And what we're seeing in regards to soil capacity, development, and other factors, some experts are predicting that we have less than 60 harvests left, which is quite scary to think about. And when we think about how we're going to feed the world, how we're going to feed ourselves, regenerative agriculture has that promise to not only feed the world, but to really mitigate the climate crisis that we're in. So we want to get into a great discussion with an extremely talented group of experts who will all introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what they are doing and how they are literally changing the world and really focusing on human and planetary health. So we will start with John Piati, who is the president and CEO of American Farmland Trust, and it's so lovely to see everybody. Thank you for being here. Really excited about the discussion today. John, we can kick it off with you.
This panel. It is a great panel, and I think we're going to have a great conversation. Earth Day really helps the public focus attention on the planet's health, and I'm so glad to be talking about food and farm issues because they're critical, and yet I feel maybe because they're right under our nose and in our mouths every day, they're kind of overlooked at times, which is really too bad. The organization that I run, American Farmland Trust, was created 42 years ago and was created really because there was a void that needed to be filled. There was no other national group at that time operating in this space, viewing agriculture and the environment as inseparable, as what we sometimes refer to as two sides of the same coin. We've come a long way in the last 40 some odd years to a point where farmers and environmentalists are no longer at loggerheads as they were. And now environmental groups view farmers as partners, and many farm groups, even many very conservative farm groups, recognize the importance of environmental farming practices. So we've come a long way, and part of Earth Day is celebrating how far we've come. And yet on these issues of food and farming and their relation to the health of the planet, and particularly the climate crisis, we are in a very challenging time, and there's so much work ahead of us. American Farmland Trust is a relatively small organization, about 150 employees, but we've had an outsized impact on both farmland protection and regenerative practices. We've done a lot of this work sort of behind the scenes, if you will. We're not really a public name. Some people know our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker, and I always carry one with me, so here it is. But they don't know much about the organization behind it. And we're really a unique organization in many ways. In one way is that we approach public policy. We've done a lot of policy work at both the state and the federal level. And we approach it in a more comprehensive manner than some other policy groups. We've always had a strong research arm, and we try to use science and data to drive policy. And we also do a lot of work in the field. We get our hands dirty, and we think that's really critical to have credibility to talk to policymakers. Beyond this, we're also somewhat of a unique organization in that we look rather holistically at three interconnected issues. One is the land itself. We feel very strongly that we need that land not only to grow food, but to provide a whole range of environmental services. The second are the practices that occur in that land. And then the third are the people, the farmers and ranchers who do the work. because if they can't make a living, and if we can't attract the next generation of farmers onto the land, we're not going to have anyone to follow the best practices that we need. So for us, it's really this holistic approach of land, practices, and people. And many people know American Farmland Trust work in one area, but don't know the other. I'll take just a moment to speak about our work. On the farmland protection side, for a lot of people, this is really what they associate AFT with, and for good reason. We really undertook the pioneering projects to use agricultural conservation easements in this country, and then we helped catalyze the creation of 29 state farmland protection programs, a number of land trusts, and of course the federal farmland protection program. And adds up to about 7 million acres of farmland that we've permanently protected. A great success, but not nearly what is needed. We've slowed the rate of farmland conversion considerably in the last 40 years, from about 3 million acres a year to about 750,000 acres a year that are being converted to non-farm use. That also is a success, but every acre we lose is a shame. It's irreplaceable land that, as I said, is not only needed for food, but to provide a whole range of services. The second area that we've been so effective and active in is with regenerative practices itself. Because if you're protecting the land, but the topsoil is washing into the rivers, if the farming practices are polluting the landscape, you're not really serving an environmental goal. So from the very beginning, AFT has also had a huge focus on this, again, often behind the scenes. We created the coalition that came together to form the 1985 Farm Bill, which was the first to include a conservation title. And that and all of the subsequent refinements to programs like CRP and EQIP that some of you may be familiar with. Those all began as AFT white papers, and those have really made a big difference. Again, a combination of demonstration projects and research and effective advocacy. But when we started working on those practices now almost 40 years ago, we were really thinking about soil health from the perspective of making sure that the land was more productive, that erosion would be reduced, that water would be retained. We really weren't thinking of carbon sequestration per se, but the same practices, any practice that builds soil health by definition is grabbing atmospheric carbon and putting it back into the soil. So we've been in this space for a long time, but it was probably only about a dozen years ago that we started to really specifically apply our work to the climate crisis. And at the federal policy level, the real first step in this regard to link climate and agriculture was the Waxman-Markey bill of 2008 and 2009. And it passed in the House. AFT had a huge role in that. But sadly, it failed in the Senate. And that really was a huge setback. And we probably haven't seen or didn't see a response to that until a few years ago. I would say that there was a period of dormancy in federal policy around this issue of climate and ag. And the change probably came, there are several factors, we could talk about that in more detail, but I think the change really came in around 2018. And one of the key factors was one of the IPCC reports that came out that year. And what it said quite clearly is that as critically as important as it is to reduce our carbon emissions, that alone will not get us to the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. We also have to take atmospheric carbon and trap it in our soils. So there was a bit of a sea change. It was wonderful for an organization like American Farmland Trust that's been proposing and pushing and promoting regenerative practices for so long. Here were policymakers and members of the public and businesses. Increasingly, we're working with companies like Danone and General Mills and Land O'Lakes and others who really earnestly see the value of their farmers following better practices. So it's been a bit of a sea change, but boy, do we have a lot further to go. I think of just one benchmark, cover crops. I think about 6% of the farmland in this nation that could be under cover crops is currently farmed that way. Our research shows that U.S. agriculture could not only be carbon neutral, but could be a carbon sink. And we could be helping offset other economic sectors that potentially can never get there. So this is, in my mind, the critical issue of our times. And it's great to be on a panel with many other kindred spirits who are working towards the same goal.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for the work that American Farmland Trust is doing. Hunter Lovins, who needs no introduction, but is the president of Natural Capital Solutions. Hunter, over to you.
Thanks so much. John mentioned the ability of soil to take carbon out of the air. This potential is enormous if we farm using regenerative agriculture. And we know how to do this. Farmers are starting to do this because it's more profitable. The way they're farming now, industrialized, mechanized, chemicalized, imposes costs. Eliminate those or reduce them, you cut your costs. This is why the farmer Gabe Brown in North Dakota helped invent this approach to regenerative agriculture. He was going broke. He said, I'll try anything. First, he went to no-till. He stopped breaking the soil, which decarbonizes, denitrifies it. Then he said, how do I get nutrients? How do I deal with all these plants coming in? He planted cover crops, then deep-rooted diverse cover crops. Now his fields are covered with all these cover crops, so he turned out his cows. The cows ate down the cover crops, fertilized the soil. Over about 20 years, he went from a little under 2% soil organic matter to, on average, 11%, some of his fields as high as 15%. Every 1% increase in soil organic material is 5 to 10 tons of carbon per acre and 20,000 gallons of water holding capacity. Why does General Mills, which John mentioned, have these principles as the basis of their regenerative agriculture? They hired Gabe. Oh, and Gabe is now profitable. He's rolling climate change backward at a profit. Fast forward to India, where the Green Revolution failed, imposed enormous costs on poor farmers who were then killing themselves, literally drinking their pesticides, which they couldn't afford, and killing themselves. A man named Vijay Kumar started working particularly with women in the villages on farms of an acre or less, taking Gabe Brown's principles. Now, they don't eat the cows there, but they use the cows for the manure, for the urine, mix it, and create a mycorrhizal inoculant, a fungal inoculant that jumpstarts the ability of the soil to mineralize carbon, which holds the water, which provides the nutrient space for the crops. They've gone from planting once a year, just before the monsoons, which with climate change are now becoming unreliable, to 3 plantings a year. So they have tripled their income. They no longer use poisons of any sort. They're healthier, their families are healthier, their communities are healthier. Vijay calls this community-managed natural farming. In India, Million Belay calls it agroecology. Same difference. Million has shown how in Africa, this approach of regenerative agriculture can deliver the promise that the Gates Foundation failed to do. They said, oh, we'll go with the Green Revolution, we'll double production. No, they didn't. Million has, and it's cheaper for the farmers, it's healthier for the farmers. This is an approach that is increasingly being practiced around the world, can make farm communities healthier, more prosperous, and solve the climate crisis when coupled with renewable energy. Yes, we have to stop emitting fossil carbon, but we also have to soak the excess carbon out of the air. Rodale Institute has shown how to do this with vegetables, with row crops. Savory Institute has shown how to do this with regenerative grazing. We've heard on this program, oh, we have to eat less meat. No, we don't. We have to eat less industrial meat. We have to eat more grass-fed meat because it's the action of the cattle, the goats, the sheep, the grazing animals on the ground that is pulling the carbon out of the air. If you don't believe me, read a paper by Greg Retallack, who shows how this is how the Earth decarbonized itself when we were at 1,000 parts per million concentration. Well, we weren't here. This is pre-humans. What got the Earth's concentration of CO2 down to the point where humans could evolve at 280 parts per million were grazing animals. We can replicate this through biomimicry, Janine Benyus's great approach of behaving in the way that nature does. And again, when we do this, we're dramatically more profitable. What can you do? I mean, you may not graze cattle, sheep. You can eat. Eating is an agricultural act, as Wendell Berry put it. What you buy, from whom you buy, matters a lot. Support your local farmers who are making this transition to regenerative agriculture. And this is what we're doing here in Colorado, working with Anthony, whom you'll hear from in a minute, and working with local farmers as part of the Colorado Regenerative Recovery Coalition, a group I helped create, to pull together hundreds of Coloradans to listen to them about what do you want coming out of the pandemic. Let's build a regenerative Colorado, not go back to the old normal that was broken. And let's do it with farmers and ranchers and people who live in apartments in the cities and businesses and industry by pulling all of us together to identify our priorities, to set forth policy. So we're working with state legislators. Our citizen engagement elicited thousands of ideas of how to build a regenerative Colorado, which we then embodied into bits of legislation, working with the politicians. It's now being implemented in Colorado through the Colorado Department of Agriculture, which is working with Anthony, and through communities across the state who are asking themselves, what kind of a world do we want to live in? Let's build a regenerative future. And when we do, we will achieve real sustainability, shared prosperity on a healthy planet.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Merlin, over to you. It's so good to see you. I'm assuming you're in Iowa.
I am in Iowa, and that's why I wore my John Deere hat, so that nobody would have a mistake as to where I was at.
Well, thank you for being here, and please introduce yourself and what you are doing with Regen Iowa and Blue Planet Science Group.
Okay, happy to do that. And I could not think of two better people to follow than Hunter and John. I've been following Hunter for 40 plus years. While I grew up in Iowa and got an education degree here. And by the way, this is my 52nd anniversary of being involved with Earthday. Because in 1970, my senior year in college, Earthday began. And on our campus at the University of Northern Iowa, we did an event, and I was proud to be there and proud to know that it was a Midwest person that it had sponsored and come up with this whole idea. So here we are 52 years later, you know, now taking it to a whole nother level, I do believe. In following Hunter and John, with Regen Iowa, we are regenerative agriculture in action. I left Iowa shortly after college, moved to Colorado, which is how I met Hunter and spent 40 plus years in the Boulder, Denver area. and then started coming back to Iowa a little over 10 years ago to work and educate with the governor in education reform, and then the Healthy Estate Initiative that was launched, and then water quality. And as I got involved in those things, and first of all, when I first went back to Iowa 40 plus years later, I almost did not recognize the state because agriculture had changed so much. And I was, quite frankly, was set back by what I went back to, was not happy with it. I'm still not happy with it, which is why I formed Regen Iowa with a number of fellow Iowans, and we've said enough is enough. We want to accomplish the things that Hunter was just describing, actually grow food, not just corn and soybeans, and grow food for our communities that has nutrition in it, and actually can provide the nutrient value that we have lost in our agricultural today for a lot of the reasons here again that Hunter mentioned on. When I started looking at the issues that Iowa was facing and realizing our issues are no different than any other state in the Midwest or across the country, I realized that we didn't really have an ag problem or a healthcare problem or an education problem. We had a systems problem. And until we started to address that system, I saw us take 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. So Regen Iowa is really a systemic approach that starts with water, soil, food, and ag, includes healthcare, education, energy, economics, and policy making. We have to have some serious policy making changes in the state to incentivize the farmers to do the right things so that we can get there. But the great thing about Iowa is that we're roughly 1% of the country. And I believe if we can address the many issues that we're going to talk about on this panel in Iowa, then we are a model for the rest of the country. And we've already started reaching out to Colorado. We're going to join them in a partnership with Regenerative Ag. We've got people in Missouri, Minnesota, Nebraska, Illinois that want to join us. So we're hoping to put together a global coalition, if you will, that literally starts in the heartland and in the Midwest to do all of the things that we need to do and to transition into this bold new world that we're evolving into. One of the people that I met recently is going to follow me, I think, in the next presentation, and that's Elizabeth Pierce. I found her, I'm not sure where we actually first met, but when I saw what she was doing with soil biology and where we were headed with Regen Ag, I said, we have got to work together because you've got the solution that we need in Iowa to rebuild our soil, get that biology healthy, and then sequester the carbon. Here again, as both John and Hunter was talking about, at a deep level so that it doesn't end up back in the air, but it actually helps grow the food into the nutrition that we have. So with all of that, I'm delighted to be here, and I will let it go to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Merlin. And you've done my job. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you. I'm the founder of SimSoil, and we are providing the biological solution for Regen Iowa. And Regen Iowa, as a nonprofit, has a goal of converting 1 million acres of farmland that is currently in conventional and agrochemical farming to regenerative agriculture. And if we can succeed in doing that and proving that it works, then we can move very quickly. You know, Iowa is the second largest state in the country in terms of food production, and 1 million acres for Iowa is about 7.8% of the total corn farmland that they have. Let me step back for a moment and just talk about SimSoil. We're focused on the complete soil ecosystem. That's how in nature the plants get the nutrient cycling that they need. Some think of it as the plants actually farm the soil microbes that are going to provide them with the nutrients that they need, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, and other elements as well, by absorbing those from the soil and then reprocessing them in a way that the plants can then absorb into themselves. The soil system is incredibly complex. It's got enormous biodiversity. There are in excess of 20,000 species in a handful of healthy soil. If you were to take all of the soil biology in 1 acre of land that's healthy, you'd have biology that had the same weight as 2 full-grown elephants standing upon the soil. In a lot of circles, this is called the soil food web. More recently, people call it the soil microbiome. Very similar in terms of its components to the gut biome. So there's a lot of information coming out about this. But the essence of what we care about is that the microbes leave behind the carbon that they have incorporated in the course of their life. That's actually how carbon sequestration happens. And if you listen to people talk about compost and you talk about ag biologics and a lot of the other information that's out there, they're focusing just on the bacteria. But there's actually 9 different types of life, and it's fungi that actually sequesters the majority of the carbon, and it's fungi that is the key to fertility. It's the fungi, the protozoas, the beneficial nematodes. Those are what's impacted by no-till farming. That's why no-till farming works. So the ranchers are ahead of the farmers in terms of this. They've seen that if you shift the soil biology, you increase the protein in the grasses. Alan Savory's done some wonderful work in this area. The plants have biodiversity, and that increases the types of foods that are out there and therefore the types of biology. SimSoil and Regen Iowa are focused on talking to Iowa farmers about improving their profitability, because until you increase their profitability, you're not really going to get them to move. So the carbon credits, the credits for soil biodiversity, the grants related to drought tolerance that are in California, SimSoil started in California, all of those are great at helping move the profitability of farmers. Our key message is lower input costs and the same or better yields and better nutrient density and better flavor, and that creates greater profitability. Where SimSoil is unique is we have developed ways to grow this complete ecosystem at industrial scale. And this is based on wild source biology. This is based on regionally specific microbiome, and we can develop crop-specific solutions based on the local biology. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I love the synergy and the commitment from this panel. And to round out this incredible panel, we have Anthony, who's the Executive Director and co-founder of Zero Foodprint. Anthony, welcome. Really excited to hear you talk about how Zero Foodprint is really mobilizing the food world around agricultural climate solutions. Over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Jillian, and thanks to the Alliance Center. So we've heard a lot about the solutions from the leaders on this panel, and I think basically I'm trying to present the plan to kind of operationalize those solutions and turn regenerative agriculture into the new normal. Because of the global audience, I'm going to kind of answer conceptually first. So imagine if every food company or every government had been taking care of the soil for the last 8 decades. Hundreds of gigatons of emissions would still be stored as healthy soil biology, according to the biogeochemists. We'd have nutrient-dense food, ample clean groundwater, we'd have resilient, thriving communities. And this is why, since first learning about regenerative agriculture, I basically have personally just gone all in. I'm going to spare you the whole life story today, but basically it's so optimistic and so plausible that I think it's the biggest opportunity in food and climate, because we can turn back the clock. These costs have been externalized, but we can internalize them. And it's going to happen one company and one government at a time, large or small. It's going to be good for business and also contribute to community prosperity. So it's basically one big fat win-win-win, just waiting for the right incentive structure and policy frameworks to scale. And I think Zero Foodprint is trying to implement those. So we lead public-private collaborations, as Hunter mentioned with the Colorado Department of Ag, also with the California Department of Food and Ag, regional governments like the City of San Francisco, Boulder County, City of Denver. and dozens of leading businesses to scale regenerative agriculture. And basically, we make it possible for an individual or a business or an organization to use $1 or $100,000 to make direct change in the field. So regenerative ag to me is the best example of global impact through local action. And the change is going to occur one field at a time, 1 acre, one practice, $1 at a time. In an aggregated food economy, though, there are so many layers of corporate extraction that the idea of a consumer voting with their dollar almost feels impotent. You know, the idea of supporting the good farmer, the regenerative farmer, there's no supply. But people and organizations want change, and they'll pay for change. According to some research, 70% of consumers will pay 35% more for the sustainable choice. So we're out there buying the good stuff, hoping change will occur. But because it's only a weak trickle-down kind of pull mechanism mediated by shareholder earnings, change is really slow. And for example, organic is just 1% of US farmland after 50 years. And so as society is embracing and maybe even relying on regenerative agriculture, we're saying we need to find a new way. And so instead of farm to table, Zero Foodprint is starting a table to farm movement. It's a strong but affordable push mechanism, and it enables direct change in the field. And so a good analogy would be in renewable energy. You know, there's a lot of work to be done, but there's been rapid progress in the last decade. Instead of kind of begging one business at a time or one homeowner to install rooftop solar, or instead of just buying products that are made with renewable energy, entire cities and counties are committing to shift to 100% renewable energy. And it's simple. You know, citizen sends $5 a month on the energy bill, something like that, whatever the program involves in that region, and it directly creates the change in energy production. So my message today is basically that a huge corporation or an entire county or state can commit to 100% regenerative agriculture. We can improve the grid of food. But of course, the question is how. So Zero Foodprint is making this real. We're already working with local governments, local soil experts, and businesses to make this kind of transformative change. Improving the grid is possible, it's plausible, it's even radically scalable. So last year, we also launched affiliate programs in Asia, Denmark, and Germany, and started farm projects in Colorado. We're going to expand to Georgia and the Northeast this year. And what we do is basically coordinate locally focused regenerative economies that can use even just a penny from a purchase. We aggregate those pennies into a fund, and then that's enough for a $20,000 compost project or to plant $10,000 worth of trees or cover crops. You know, basically based on whatever projects have the most climate benefit for that region. Dozens of stakeholders and carbon experts came together to create a system for this kind of optimal and equitable selection of projects, improving the grid. And we even have ordinances ready for local policymakers to level up the programs from a few businesses opting in to everyone having an opt-out. So basically, we can include tiny but crucial fees for regeneration across the entire economy. You know, imagine if $1 per month on the trash bill was going to regenerative ag, or 1% on your Amazon or McDonald's purchase, you know, generating billions of dollars per year to change acres. The big global climate research like Project Drawdown finds that 1% of GDP redirected toward the best solutions would be enough to lower global temperatures. So to put that another way, going from 0% for climate to 1% towards regenerative ag and other solutions could still save us, but we have to start now. So for regenerative ag to become the new normal, all we have to do is team up with farmers and ranchers to grow better food and restore the climate, and it can happen one penny at a time. Thanks.
Thank you. I know we've spent a lot of time introducing ourselves, but let's get into a discussion. And I do want to ask the panelists, just due to time, if we could keep our responses to about a minute, so we can all have time for the questions, a little discussion, and closing remarks. So the first question I want to go to John. John, you talked about the IPCC report, but I want to talk about the one that was recently released in its latest report on climate change and land use. The urgency of putting carbon back into the soil is greater now more than it has ever been. Can you tell us how AFT is addressing land use under pressure currently?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that report's on everyone's mind. I could take a lot of time getting into this, and you asked me not to, so I'll just hit a couple of highlights. Point number one is our focus and the focus of many other organizations that we work with at this point is really to scale things up. And we have the tools. This point you've heard this from the panel, that we know what we need to do. The issue is we're not doing it at great enough scale. So on multiple levels, AFT through our regional offices, through some of our national work, we're trying to scale up. But the real point I want to make about that report is, although it was quite concerning in many ways, there was also a thread of real hope in that report. And it was that the latest science shows that we can actually reverse temperature increase over time if we ultimately get enough carbon back in the soil. So for those people who are now just focused on climate adaptation, say, no, folks, we can mitigate this thing. Don't forget the prize that is in sight. We can heal this planet through regenerative agriculture.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. Hunter, according to the estimates compiled by the FAO, by 2050, we will need to produce 60% more food to feed a world population of 9.3 billion people. Doing the farming as usual approach would take a really heavy toll on our natural resources. How can we feed the world with regenerative agriculture?
Industrial farming is failing. We have hundreds of hungry people, hundreds, thousands, millions of hungry people. Climate change is just going to make this worse. We have famine right now in the Horn of Africa, famine threatening millions, billions of people around the world. And at the same time, we are spending $1 million a minute subsidizing industrial agriculture, which is failing. So step one, let's take a little bit of that money and start putting it into regenerative agriculture, which, as in the case of Vijay Kumar, can triple production just through shifting from industrial to community managed natural farming. Let's start using the best of what we know to enable smallholder farmers who today produce 70 to 80% of the food around the world to do so a bit more productively. People say, oh, it's the industrial American farmer who's going to feed the world. No, it's not. It's the smallholder farmer learning how to implement more regenerative practices that will feed the world. Don't have to believe me. This is the conclusion of a report called Wake Up Before It's Too Late by the UN's Conference on Trade and Development, which said in terms, industrial agriculture cannot feed the world. It's going to be the smallholder farmers. And so we need to provide them around the world with how to do this. So a group that I work with called Now Partners is in the process of producing interviews with people like Vijay and Million and farmers in Brazil and Gabe Brown in the Dakotas, people from around the world who are doing this, succeeding in this. We call it the regenerative future of food. Wait for it.
We have the black. Thank you so much. And with that in mind, Merlin, our current agricultural model has a very hierarchical top-down structure. What does regenerative agriculture do to level the structures and really distribute power evenly?
Well, that's exactly what it does do. I mean, it's interesting. When I first started my Regen Iowa initiative about 7 years ago, there was a lot of resistance to the fact that Regen Ag was not profitable enough and it was too much work. But it's like we have crossed over that industrial chasm to the point to where we've got this renewed energy in regards to regenerative ag. I, for example, am sitting, and I chose to be out here to make my broadcast. I'm in Coon Rapids, Iowa, out in rural Iowa, just an absolutely beautiful spot out here. And I'm sitting in the center of the White Rock Conservancy, which is an indicator of how I think things are starting to change in Iowa and across the country. We, for example, put together, or the White Rock Conservancy is the owners of a soil health conservation easement. the first of its kind in the country, as far as we know, and certainly the first of its kind in the state. And what that easement allows, has allowed the White Rock Conservancy and the founders of it, the Garst Foundation, is to allow them to sell off acres of land, but that easement would allow the principles of soil health to be continued. The three primary principles are continuous living roots, mitigation of soil disturbance, and a mitigation of soil erosion. So it's that kind of initiatives that are starting to come to the forefront and take the lead in this whole regenerative ag movement that we're talking about. And we're happy to see that happen in Iowa, thanks to the Garst family and the White Rock Conservancy. But having said all that, that means that leveling the playing field here and empowering the farmers with new tools and technologies, helping them create more profitability with the regenerative types of things that we're discussing on this program, ultimately means that the farm to the table and then the table to the farm, which Anthony is helping launch across the country, means that healthier food is going to be on the table for our families. And that means that we can address one of the biggest challenges we have here in Iowa, which is healthcare alone, primarily due to the fact of the way that we do agriculture. So I think the hierarchy is on notice that it is changing, that we, the people, are stepping forward, wanting regenerative practices, not only to address climate change and to save our planet, but quite frankly, to save the human species. And we're all on this panel just the tip of the iceberg, but it's headed your way.
It is the tip of the iceberg. Thank you, Merlin. And Elizabeth, just talking about that, and we've heard a lot about carbon sequestration, but if you could just spend a minute talking about measuring soil carbon and the environmental benefits. A lot of times, we're getting a lot of responses is, what does that actually mean, and can we actually achieve it? If you could spend a little time talking about that.
Yes, the answer is yes, we can achieve it. The goal of Regen Iowa is to get 1 million acres converted to Regen Ag by 2025. And that's because the average regenerative farm has 200 plus microns of carbon per gram. And the back of my envelope says that, if we were to do 20 million acres, that would completely offset the carbon footprint of the United States. So this is a very achievable goal. And the question is, how fast can we get there? There's some really interesting technologies, and it's an evolving field of how you measure it. Earlier, Hunter and I were speaking about the ecological outcome verification system of the Savory Institute. There's the Haney method. There's a number of people working with satellites and with software. I personally am a big advocate of the microbiometer, which is a very low-cost test that farmers can do in the field with a smartphone app. And that product, Merlin's actually showing that, that product is a wonderful tool for farmers. You can look at the difference between land that has less than 100 microns, which is typical of carbon per gram, which is typical of most industrial farms, and you can look at plants that are grown literally inches away that are, and I'll post a picture of this on the We Don't Have Time website, and I'd love to use that platform to answer questions from your audience, but the plants are almost unrecognizable as the same species because of the fungal content and the other microbes that are in the soil. And unfortunately, from my perspective, investors are much more interested in spending money on technology to measure this than in actual solutions that can speed that process up, whether they call it biomimicry or other things. It all comes down to growing the biology and replacing those ecosystems in the soil.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Anthony, we've heard a lot about the importance of regenerative agriculture. Can you explain how zero footprint can help scale the movement from advocates to a new normal?
Sure. I first really learned about that as a chef. And so we were running a restaurant, The Perennial, and we were really championing regenerative ag. This started back in 2015, before most people had even heard the term, I think. And, we're in San Francisco. It's kind of like farm to table everywhere. People almost have like farm to table fatigue. But so we'd be serving sourdough bread made from kernza, this perennial grain. Hey, this could change all of agriculture. Serving, beef from a carbon farming project where they were doing holistic grazing, like Hunter was referring to, plus compost application. And so I think on 1/10 of the ranch, after a few years, the project had already taken in as much carbon as not burning 1 million gallons of gas. So radically climate beneficial. The problem is in the US, there's 760 million acres of pasture and rangeland with cattle on it. A lot of it goes into the feedlot, et cetera. We don't approve of that, but it started to feel like there was no way for, that $1 from the consumer to make enough change. And beg the consumer, tell them this amazing story, hope that they spend that extra dollar, and then it might end up getting the farmer a few cents. Maybe the farmer's just using it to make ends meet, this and that. We know farming's tough, but really there was like no way that that couple cents was ever going to incentivize the farmer's neighbor. And so that again is, I think it really like crystallized for me when some soil scientists told me like, hey dude, organic is 1% of acres after 50 years, right? And so, we stopped kind of bending over backwards, trying to beg the consumer for the dollar, and instead tried to focus on this structural change and this kind of collective action.
Thank you so much, Anthony. We have spent a lot of time talking about this today, but we could spend all day, all month, all year talking about regenerative agriculture. But in the last couple minutes that we do have together, I would like just to hear some closing remarks from our panelists. Just a little bit about what regenerative agriculture means to consumers and how consumers can play a role. Hunter, you did mention, it's the power of the dollar, right? It's what we buy. But if each of you can spend 30 to 45 seconds in the last few minutes that we have just for some closing thoughts, we would really appreciate it. John, we could start with you.
Sure. Well, I always resist simple solutions. But I do think in some ways we overcomplicate this. Really what we need to do is figure out mechanisms to compensate farmers for not only growing food, but for the full range of environmental services that they provide. And if we can get to that point, other things will take care of themselves because the best practices do pay for themselves. So how do we get there? And the answer is both a combination of government policy and market forces. We are terrible as a nation on understanding multivariables. Maybe the classic is diet and exercise, right? We can't figure out that you have to do both to get to the outcome. But I deal with policy all the time, and there's this group of people who think policy is the answer, and there's another group of people who say, no, government just screws everything up. The answer is always in the market. And the real answer is you need both. And when operating at the best, they're synergistic and they reinforce each other. So there are issues with measurement, like Elizabeth pointed out. Let those things that we know are good practices, but you can't quantify at a level that you can get a market to pay for it, let government support those items. And let the items that lend themselves to carbon trading or to the General Mills of this world getting value in the supply chain, let them work on that.
Yeah, I agree. We all have to work together. We're all part of the solution. So
exactly. So
we're all part of the solution.
I will stop there. Thank you all.
Thank you, John. Hunter, closing remarks.
Sure. Do one thing. Ask yourself every day, what's your dot? Do one thing. Here are two things that you can consider. We're told plant trees. If you've ever seen a tree blow over, look at the roots. The roots are tiny compared to the biomass of the tree. Trees burn in forest fires. They rot if they just lay there and release the carbon. Grass The biomass is below ground. When things are grazing on it, the roots are sloughing polysaccharides, sugars, feeding the microbiological community that Elizabeth's been talking about. So don't plant a tree. Buy locally raised, grass-fed chicken, pork, beef, lamb. Connect with your local farmer. Do one thing. 2, where's your money? What are you invested in? A group of us put together a little exchange-traded fund. Change Finance, change-finance.com. We offset the carbon to the point that the companies that you're holding, to the extent you're holding them, are carbon negative through a group called Grassroots Carbon that's taking the money and spending it on regenerative grazing. Those are 2 things you can do today.
Thank you, Hunter. The power of our dollar. Merlin, closing thoughts from you.
Okay, my closing thought takes me back to when I graduated from high school in 1965, and 4% of Iowans had a chronic disease back then. What do you think it is today? I'll leave that question out there, but I'm going to answer it as well. It is now approaching 60% and surpassing that. So what are we doing different today, or what has caused this increase in chronic disease across our state and across our country? We've got to address that, because while we're talking about climate change and climate crisis and agricultural change and so forth, perhaps the biggest crisis we have in front of us in America and in the world is our health care. And so if we adopt regenerative agricultural practices, we can fix healthcare by providing food as medicine. Food is medicine, ladies and gentlemen. We have forgotten that, in part because when I was growing up on a farm back here, all food was organic. And so we've got to get back to that. And I'm very hopeful that as organizations like those of us that are on this panel come together and start collaborating and working together, which is what Hunter and I and John and Elizabeth and Anthony are all committed to, we can accelerate what we're doing, learn from each other. We don't have to reinvent the wheel in every state. When one state learns something, we can share it with the others. That's what Regen Iowa is about. It's really a national model and a global model, and we're looking to do it with all the people on this panel.
Thank you, Merlin.
Hope you all join us.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth, just quickly we don't have much time left. We have less than a minute, so 30 seconds.
Sure, no problem.
Closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts, I keep coming back to the soil biology, and you can, wherever you are in the world, find practitioners of Korean natural farming, soil food web, permaculture design. There are a number of indigenous traditions. They all are techniques for improving the ecosystem and the biodiversity of the soil. Find those practitioners in your community, for your garden, for your farm. Use them. That's the key.
Thank you. Anthony.
My one thing would be team up with farmers and ranchers to take the next step. So don't just buy from the good farmer, help the good farmer get better, help the conventional farmer start making the switch. And aside from buying, I think the big one is compost. I'm going to plug our program here, but basically just society needs to start viewing compost as equally as important as renewable energy, and just start making major policy shifts to compost and build up healthy soil that way.
Thank you so much. It sounds like we all have our marching orders, and I want to thank the panel for joining us today on Earth Day. We know that Earth Day is every day. It's not just April 22nd. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. We don't have time. And also, don't, like Elizabeth said, join the platform. She will be sharing a lot of pictures and information that will be very useful. And if you want to know more about the Regenerative Agriculture program at Earth Day, please visit earthday.org. Thank you so much, everyone, and happy Earth Day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.